Thank you so much for being so patient. I hope you feel comfortable. And I hope you are also excited as well as I am to have this special guest tonight, South African artist whose exhibition Le Sale Kgotso yesterday we opened. Lebohang Kganye, welcome to Berlin.
Thank you, Marina.
How are you feeling?
Great. I think when I arrived, I was a bit anxious. I think before any opening, particularly of a new work, there is anxiety around it, around whether what you imagined, how it sort of lives in the physical, and how people receive it.
But you're a master of imagination, I would say. We'll hear about this more later. I think it's maybe better that you tell something and briefly about yourself and who you are, better than I do. Who is Lebohang Kganye?
So I am Lebohang Kganye. I'm an artist from Johannesburg, South Africa. I studied at the Market Photo Workshop. I actually studied photography because I couldn't get into journalism school. I thought I wanted to be a journalist because I loved writing, and so I thought to be a writer, to be able to tell stories would mean that I had to go to journalism school. And then I got there, and it was in a moment when there was, I want to say, one of the controversial presidents at the time, and then during one of our classes for an assignment on photojournalism, I then went to photograph, or we were supposed to go photograph this person. Then I realized I actually don't want to be a journalist. Like, I'm fine here, and so that's how I became open to exploring photography. And so my journey with photography started by chance. It started with the Market Photo Workshop. And before that point, I'd actually been, when I was in my teenage years, I was involved in theater quite a bit. And so that sort of comes through in my practice, my interest in theater and in storytelling, or literature rather, and on writing. So photography allowed me to bring in all of my different interests, I'd say.
Amazing, but you didn't stop with photography. Tonight we will explore Lebohang's practice, process. I would like also to talk about the medium and themes. And at the end, we will also talk a little bit about the book that artists will, at the end of this 45-minute conversation, sign. As you said, we have a new exhibition produced, on which we worked for the past year. We commissioned a brand new body of work, Le Sale Kgotso. Could you tell us what this exhibition, or maybe title, means for you personally and artistically, especially when we think about the meaning?
So just going back to this conversation of theater, photography, performance. After my studies at the Market Photo Workshop, I actually worked for about 2 years on television productions, and as a publicist photographer. And then when I was there, I actually realized, so I was on set almost every day. Then I realized, set design could become something I sort of bring into my practice. And so the installation that you'll see upstairs, and that sort of way of working had a lot to do with me being on television production sets. And so I then was like, okay, maybe I could explore set design, or the sort of languages of set design. And for me, I think all of these, or speaking to all of this, speaks to how I've sort of approached my practice. Because I don't have an attachment to the medium of photography, I'm able to sort of think outside the box. I'm able to, and because I'm not attached to the camera and the sort of, the same sort of technicalities I think that a lot of photographers are, I think that sort of freed me to think about it not just as a sort of medium of truth, as a medium of documentary, but also as a medium of the imaginary. And so imagination has been a large part of my work, and alongside memory. And the work that's upstairs, Kgotso, speaks to that. So when you invited us, or invited me to come into the space and basically imagine a work. So I was basically given a blank canvas, and I didn't want to create new work. I know Marina doesn't want me to say this. I didn't want to create a new work, but we eventually agreed, and it became a really exciting process. But also, when we eventually came to the conclusion that we would produce a work that would allow me also to think about the moment that that we're sort of celebrating or reflecting on in South Africa, which last year was 30 years of democracy. We then started to think about that alongside some of the symbols of democracy, and one of the symbols of democracy was the RDP housing, which was housing or sort of subsidized housing for people of color in South Africa, to also allow them to be able to have land and access to housing per se. And so the installation upstairs is linked to this moment of thinking about not photography, but thinking about democracy, thinking about the house, but also what happens inside the house, and then tying that to what my practice is, sort of what I've always done in my practice, which was to go back to my community, go back to my family, and almost, engage them through oral histories. So contrast official histories and the sort of big history with oral histories and people's memories. So to allow history to live alongside personal narratives. And so Kgotso becomes this imagination of the home through mythology, through stories that have been narrated to me by my grandmother and my aunts, and bringing that into the setting of like an RDP house or a deconstructed RDP house. And in all of the works, I become this, I perform all of these stories that they've told me.
So now when we are talking about more topic and content, you are inspired a lot with myths, mythology, but also your national history, your personal history. Can you tell us more about that? And also, how do you balancing between this personal storytelling and, let's say, universal narratives,
So, what was great, I think, between yesterday and today, with opening the exhibition, and today with giving a short walkabout, because I wasn't sure. So when we eventually started, so when the press for the exhibition came out, then I realized I actually wonder how people are going to relate to these stories, and if it's something, or the stories are too much of like South African storytelling, or if it's stories that people can sort of relate across culture, across country, or different countries. And it's been great also hearing how people are able to be like, yes, we've heard the story of the serpent in our, when we were growing up, we've heard the story of like the mermaid in the house, in certain houses. And so I think for me, that's also been great because for a long time my practice has been very much centered on my family history. And so thinking about South Africa through the lens of my family, particularly in my research over the last 12 years on my family name Kganye, which means light. And, so Kganye is spelled in these 4 different ways within my own intimate family. And so I then started to do this research and trying to trace which one was the correct way to spell it, and, how my family ended up in different parts of South Africa, where, and, how they spelled it, and what had been shared to them about our family history. And so for years, I think my practice has been quite tied to family narrative, or my personal narratives. And so this work is really still looking at South Africa, but through collective stories. So these are stories that, yes, I was told by my family, and these stories that are told as if they have happened within the community. But then when we then share them or would share them as children, and sometimes there'd be similarities, sometimes you've got a unique story that they've told you. And so now it's like you're never really sure whether these stories were myth or just storytelling within families. And so what was interesting also is that it becomes almost collective mythology or collective stories. So it's not just your story as a child or your story that was shared to you, but also becomes within the community. So it's like also this collective memories is what the work is about, and thinking then about history and democracy through this lens.
But then how do you see yourself as an author, archivist? I mean, it's a huge responsibility. How do you approach to these topics? How do you decide which part of history to preserve and what to reimagine? You know, when you're performing memory and you're doing that.
I mean, I think there's a lot already of what has been claimed as official histories, right? And I think sometimes it writes out communities, it erases what communities have experienced and what they say is the experience of a country, of just their people. And so for me, I think the beauty of, or for me, why oral history is important is how it presents other types of stories, other types of truth, other types of histories and memories. But in the same breath, it also is important for me to think about or to introduce imagination, because the imagination also is a huge part of how we survive, how we're able to imagine a future. So yes, I'm very much interested in history, but the work is not stuck in time. It's very much also about the imagination of a future, the imagination of sort of alternative histories, the histories that have not been written in as well. And I mean, even when, one of the photographers that I enjoy is Santu Mofokeng, and one of his works is very closely linked to one of my earliest works as well. So my work is Gilefalaka, which is tied to my family photo albums in relation to my late mother, and me staging my mother's photographs, standing in the same or finding the same locations where she'd been photographed and wearing the same clothes. And Santu Mofokeng's work, there's a book that he produced, which it's not his work, but it's a research project that's quite strong. The Black Family Photo Album, which speaks to staged family photo albums, but also really what's special for me about that work is about how, he speaks to imagination as well. So he speaks to imagination within families, but also how that outside of just the oral side, how that comes up also through the family photo album, and how imagining yourself or the sort of performance of an ideal self is also how we survive. And so that work is quite special. But also another work of his that is part of his book, Chasing Shadows, which is very much also about the township experience, and also the sort of refusal that you can have as a practitioner or as a photographer to document the violence. You can speak to our histories, but also refuse to document the violence. So I think I got lost in what you'd asked me.
It's beautiful what you said. You need to have ability to do that in that way. And I also think that when you choose to have the role both as an author and a subject, because you're also performing, that you develop amazing ability to make the present of something that is absent, you know, all these untold stories, hidden stories, you know. Could you tell us more about that? Because I see a lot of our guests were also surprised and didn't recognize you in the exhibition upstairs. When did you decide it? Was it from the beginning? We saw it also in your early photographs when you overlapped the images and archival photographs from your family albums with the new ones. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I mean, I also speak about the question of being an author. So I think because my work has been so closely linked to communal stories, you know, I've never thought of myself as the author. I think also the work is speaking to some degree against this grand author, and that's why oral history is a huge part of it for me. And so, yes, I am, you know, I'm sort of the one that retells the story or reimagines the story. So I've been told the story, whether it's from my grandparents or from my aunts or uncles, or from the community, and I listen. As you're listening, you're also imagining it from your perspective. So you're imagining it through your own lens. And this is also the beauty, to some degree, of oral histories and of memory, is I can only understand it from my own experiences and where I come from. And so it becomes, then that's why for me, when we think about memory, it actually lives alongside imagination, because I wasn't there. I'm imagining it according to what you're telling me from a very limited, sometimes, point of view. And then deciding to be a subject in almost all the works, and what you'll see in the installation upstairs is I'm the subject in all of the different scenes that you'll see. I don't know if when I started my practice, because that's something that I did from very early on, I don't know if it was a conscious decision per se. Perhaps it also came from the fact that I had already been involved in theater and in performance since I was like maybe 14. And so, you know, so staging and performance was already part of my practice. And so in the moment then when I take up photography or start to use the medium of photography, this telling of the story through being in front or being on stage became something that was quite natural for me. So I don't know if there was, maybe later on there became a more conscious decision about that, but when I started, it was the fact that I wanted to tell the story. And so you know, from theater, with you want to tell the story, you're on the stage. And so that's how I would say it started.
Last week, actually a few days ago, you opened your exhibition in MoMA, which was part of New Photography 2025. And there we could see kinetic objects, actually. All the same cutouts, photographs, but they were moving. And you said, I see how my practice is growing and changing. So from pure photographs to I would like to also talk about the patchwork I saw in your studio when I visited you in Johannesburg. Then to these constructions, wooden constructions, first cutouts, to the aluminium, I would say almost perfection of what you can imagine from cutouts. What I wanted to ask, all these narration, how do you see, what was your inspiration, what was the guideline, how do you choose materials and object? Is it defined by the topic or by the new commission, or is it just happening naturally? This is what I was pointing to. Yeah.
So, as I mentioned earlier, because I'm not attached to the medium of photography, like I think about it in the same way that I think about theater and the way that I think about literature, that it's a space for me to tell the story, or it's a tool for me to tell the story. And so sometimes some work start with me being quite clear on the sort of materiality that I want. And then some works, it's really the idea, and it takes a long time to sort of decide that, okay, this is going to end up as dioramas. Whereas with, let's say, the fabric works that you saw when you came to my studio in Johannesburg, That had been a work that I'd been thinking about for quite some time. It sits to some degree outside of my other works because it is, it's on fabric, and so, but it's still speaking very much the family photo album. But it's, you know, it had been something that, because when I started the research around my family name, somehow it became centered around my grandfather. And then, you know, I was obviously thinking about how surnames and family histories, you know, there can be like a lot of erasure of women within families, in terms of just the stories, and particularly because the research also focused on something called Izithakazelo, which is like a praise poem that becomes a narration of your family lineage, but it actually focuses on the males in the family. So it actually tells their story and it writes them into your history. And so when you narrate this poem, that becomes a sign of you knowing who you are and where you come from. What it actually is like it's almost erased the woman in the family history. And so when I was doing that research on the family name, I started to get quite frustrated with this. Yes, I appreciated that the history that I was gathering allowed me to make a sort of trace of the name, and also, you know, my grandfather became central in it because he was the first one to move to the city in Johannesburg. He refused to become a farm laborer like the rest of my family. And so as apartheid was ending, the house that I grew up in, which a lot of these stories that I'm speaking about in the installations are stories that I heard when I was in that house. So it became quite central in the family story and in the family history, because then the rest of my family then, as apartheid ended, moved to Johannesburg and to the city through him and lived in his house, in this house that I grew up in. They lived there at different parts until they found their own homes in the city, until they found jobs and were able to afford to move out. And so my grandfather then becomes quite central in this family story. So I appreciated, when I started this research, understanding all of those nuances and being able to understand also how central this house that I grew up in was, and that the stories that I narrate for this show I heard in that house. And so, but later then I was like, okay, but you know, I keep on hearing about the males. This is sort of what keeps on coming up. And so Msebenzi Wadirite, this fabric work, was a work that I'd been thinking about since 2013, but I hadn't found the right medium and how I'd do it. And so only much later, maybe 10 years later, then I started these fabric works, which are quite monumental and speak to this erasure of the woman in the family. And so, yeah, and so different works have really come up in different ways. There's the work that we've recently created in Cameroon, and that work was my first work outside or made that was not about South Africa. So we had been invited by an institution in Cologne. I don't know if Lucia's here. I think that's why I'm looking around. So Lucia's the curator from Cologne, and actually her partner is the one that worked on this installation upstairs that you'll see. And so Lucia had invited me to go through her museum's collection and choose whichever part of their collection I wanted to respond to. And we eventually came across some panoramic drawings that were made between 1911 and 1913 in Cameroon. And that became the material. So in as much as the museum had so many photographs, but the material that I felt the strongest connection to were these landscape drawings that were made in Cameroon. And then I started to think about how with photography, it's quite easy to identify the violence of it within, especially in contexts like that. But I'd never, before that moment, thought about the sort of violence also of erasure that existed within those sort of colonial enterprises of erasing whole communities and making it seem like, you know, landscapes or certain places in the world didn't belong to anybody. And, you know, the sort of power of landscape drawings and landscape paintings. And so this work then becomes this, becomes me working with the, you would say the pen drawings or drawings and thinking about landscapes. And so every work is different. So it depends on how I sort of, whether it's a response to the material or whether it's like a response to the topic, and then it's like later then finding what material it sort of wants to exist as. And that culminated into a film, this work that we made in Cameroon.
You're really challenging the ongoing discussion what photography could be. You also did a film, moving image. When was your last one?
So the work that I just mentioned now, the process of it was, so we discovered the drawings, and it was not really part of the official museum collection. So we had spent about 2 years going back and forth. The first year we were going back and forth, similar to a project that I'm producing now in Florence. So spending a month there, spending 2 months, or spending 2 weeks, then going back to Johannesburg and thinking about some of the material. And then after about a year of sort of this back and forth in Cologne, then I was like, do you not have other material? Like, because I'm not feeling like I wanna, or I'm not having a strong attachment or connection with the photographic material. And I was obviously interested in what was part of, because this museum was an ethnographic museum, so I was obviously interested in what had been taken from Africa and what had been taken from South Africa. So that's how I started initially, and then I was clear that I didn't want to work with the photographic material, and but I was also interested in what was the female gaze within the collection. And so then finally we found this box that was somewhere in the attic that was not part of the official collection, and then it had these pen drawings, these landscape drawings, and then realizing that the woman that had, or the person that had done it was a woman who had gone to Cameroon, a husband, because the husband was a geographer, and so he had been commissioned by the city for him to go survey the land, basically, and see if it was worth Germany colonizing. And so he had motivated for her to come with, because she was a visual artist and could therefore do the sort of supporting material for this research. And so they'd spent 3 years, and she was taking photographs, she was drawing the landscapes. Because he was a geographer, their focus to a large degree was the landscape and the land, and what could be extracted from the land. And also another part was that she was sending letters back home to family and friends, and these later got published as a travel journal. And she speaks about, in one of the letters, she speaks about how they had over 700 people carrying these objects that are now in different museums in Germany. And so eventually, after going through all of these different materials related to this work or this collection, we then realized that actually the work was going to be me going to Cameroon and going to some of the sites that I could identify in the drawings according to the text that she had written, and returning the objects that, so symbolically returning them. So the objects that are in the different museums. So we would basically go to the different parts in Cameroon and return it to that land. And so the film moves between, so it's a 22 channel film, and in each channel I'm in a different part of Cameroon and returning an object that is in one of the museums in Germany that Maria Throbeck mentions in her diaries.
Interesting. And speaking, I mean, you were exhibiting now in America and all around the globe. Okay, this is example how you collaborated with the community in Cameroon. But how do you see your work in a dialogue with the broader cultural and historical narratives, like not only in South Africa and African continent, but also like globally?
So there's been different kinds of collaborations. One that, the recent one that you mentioned is the work that we just opened 2 days ago at MoMA, is called Staging Memories, and it's a work that I made in between 2021 and 2022, and it actually only came 3 years or so after I had gone to, so I was interested in how do I get my installations to have movement in the same way that like some of the films have movement. And so I had gone on a residency in Geneva for about 3 months, and during my residency, I wanted to spend time with watchmakers. So obviously, because of the history of Switzerland and Geneva with watchmaking. So I then spent the 3 months spending time with watchmakers, going to watch markets, like it was quite fascinating. But like really thinking about mechanism and movement. So watchmakers, puppet makers, automaton makers, and after the 3 months, I went back home to Johannesburg and put that research to rest because I didn't yet know what to do with it. And only then, about 3 years later, I then decided that perhaps it was time to return to this research and explore making a work in Switzerland using all of this research, because I now had a work that because I'd read a book by Mutin Hlema, a Malawian writer, that was basically, it was a science fiction novel, and so he was reimagining or thinking about reimagining South African history, but he was a Malawian writer. So I was also interested in, how we imagine also each other's histories, but also how we can think about history as not something static, as something, presenting alternative scenarios. Had this person not become the president, had this happened at this point in history, what could have been the future of this country? And so that's basically what that novel was about. And so I then started to think, okay, this is the perfect novel, because it's sort of, throughout the novel, you're not sure whether you're in the past, the future, the present, where you are. And so I was like, okay, that's the perfect work to imagine this research, or to sort of bring in this research of this watchmaking, and like because of how it's play on like time and this play on like history. And so I then decided to work on staging memories, looking at or reimagine or thinking through Mutin Hlema's novel, science fiction novel. And so that's the work that's currently at MoMA. Now I got lost again about the question.
No worries. I would like to hear what did you get from your audience and what you learn? I think for every artist should be important their relationship with the audience and how they approach your work. But how do you navigate your audience, and what do you want them to take after seeing your work? We saw here, and I also saw in February at local biennial, that you shown your work in a public space in a park. Also in the museums, in the closed spaces. What is the difference when we're talking about the audience and diversity of them?
So, I mean, the work lives in multiple contexts. Even, I think, the creation of the work has so many layers to it. So today I was speaking with somebody who was trying to understand the process of making a work like the one that's upstairs. And I was explaining that, sometimes after you've decided, or like with this work, we've decided that, okay, we're gonna focus on the RDP housing, we're gonna focus on mythology in order to ask this question of democracy, but also obviously on personal stories and that sort of tension with official histories. And so once we had decided the 4 central stories, then the next step was, okay, but also the building of a house was the first thing that we had decided. We're like, okay, we're gonna build a house. Which was very dramatic in the beginning. So Anna Rivedu, who's my studio manager, is here. She was like, no, we are not building a house. Do you know how expensive? Because, I think also as a team, there's moments when, sometimes you have to calm down an idea, and there's moments when, we have to sort of push for that idea. And so it started with us deciding on building the house, and then we decided it's not gonna have walls, and then, and then obviously the scale, and then we then started to obviously build the concept. But it went through obviously different steps. One of the early steps with the production is also about sourcing all of the different elements that make up the scene. And so we worked with, for the first time actually, we worked with some theater productions in Johannesburg. and went to their costume department or their set department and photographed the elements that we had identified were necessary for this house. And then later it was my performances and then sourcing some of the costumes for the performances. And then from that point, we then started to build the small boxes, the sort of maquette versions to some degree of this large installation. And then the next few months were then the actual fabrication of this life-size installation that is upstairs. So it goes through many different moments. Sometimes a budget dictates how it goes, but sometimes the idea is so big that, like in this case where the budget is able to be pushed because we do want to build a house and we all want the house.
I mean, unconsciously building a house means preparing a foundation, grounding, making a safe space. You are born in Johannesburg, you live there. Can you tell us a little bit about life there? Many people it's like talking about the differences between Cape Town, Johannesburg, mystification of that city. What for you as an artist means to live there, and how do you see your future there?
So Johannesburg is, as we call it, Joburg, is a very interesting place. I mean, not everybody actually in traveling there or in visiting there adjusts to it immediately or enjoys the sort of tensions of it. But it's a very textured city, so it really depends on you as well. I've always said that it's Cape Town and Johannesburg, as the sort of two big metropolitans in South Africa, have two very different personalities. And so there's the more coastal side, which is more like California situation, which is Cape Town. And then there's the more textured city, which is like New York, which is Johannesburg. So it depends on the sort of intensity that you can take. But for me, that is a huge part of what inspires my work, the sort of texture of the city, the sort of tensions and the sort of tensions, the sort of possibilities of like a big city like that also bring. But also in terms of the work that comes out of like a space that is as alive, like Johannesburg, is something that I would struggle even as at times when I've ever considered moving, I know that I would struggle to get that sort of energy that ultimately then informs my practice, that ultimately energizes me to produce in the way that I do and my mind to be able to be as open as it is. But there's also another side, a more practical side, which is the spirit of collaboration also that exists in Johannesburg. I think because there's so many so many different types of artists that are doing such amazing works, working to some degree from very little and are able to do so much, and to sort of rethink, because of sometimes resources, rethink what are the possibilities of still creating from this place or from, not very much. And so that at times helps you produce something original, something that, you're not also working from a place of comfort. But really for me, it's the texture of the city that I don't think I can find anywhere and still have my work be what it is.
Yeah, you said you're traveling so much, I can't wait to come back and just be there, and you have an amazing studio and people who are working with you, and I see you also as a collective. Do you see, like in the near future, that you're somehow materialize or your ideas, and do you want to build something for future generations and artists there? I think we spoke something about that. I think it's beautiful.
Thank you. So we are in a very interesting moment as a studio because we have a very collective way of working, a very collaborative way of working. As I mentioned, all of the different works have really not been me alone, and that's what I've also enjoyed about Johannesburg. So outside of the communal aspect of like my family and the sort of communities that I grew up in, But the communal aspect, I think, within the cultural space for me has been a huge part of my practice. And also then, in terms of me, because of my love also for theater, and Anna's love for music, and my sister is, who's my studio assistant, comes from like an animation and script writing background. And so all of us have that spirit of like collaboration, or our work or what we love is very much linked to like very collaborative types of practices. So we are really in a moment where we want to really expand on that, and we are in the we're in the process of starting a center that would be very much supporting different practices, have a library to it. Also, another part that is really missing for a lot of artists is the archiving of their material, particularly photography. And so because of the sort of network that I've been able to build over the last 12 years, I want to bring that into my community and be able to support other practices through this center that we're in the process of building.
I mean, the scene is so vivid. You have so many talented people. Last two Deutsche Börse Photography Prizes went into the hands of South African artists, your colleague. And speaking about the collaboration, you also published a book with Sue Williamson. Tell me what you remember. I was lucky enough to see her retrospective in Cape Town. Two different generations, two amazing artists from South Africa. Sue Williamson is born in 1941, you are 1990. This is amazing cross-cultural dialogue with images, photographs, objects. Could you tell me something and tell us something about this book that we are promoting today?
So tell me what you remember happened through a conversation with Emma Lewis, who was the curator. And I will say, sitting here today, that one thing that I'm so appreciative of as an artist in this moment is I've had such amazing collaborations with curators, including yourself.
Thank you.
And Emma Lewis was also one of those experiences. I know, as artists, it's easy for us to always speak about, the moments that are the moments of tension with institutions, or moments of tensions with institutions. But I also think it's important to also speak to moments when, because of the spirit of collaboration, when something beautiful was able to take place. And this is this exhibition that you'll see today is a result of that for me. Yourself and Jessica Jal, I don't know if she's still here. She said she might be leaving early. So she's the Globals exhibition curator for Fotografiska and is working at the one in Stockholm. So both you and her have been really amazing to collaborate with. And it's this, I think the exhibition that we had with Sue Williamson was curated by Emma Lewis, and it was a very similar energy. And that was a longer exhibition in the making because the conversation started before COVID and then COVID happened. But actually what it allowed us to do was to be able to have many moments of reflection, and the exhibition and the catalog for me reflects that. It reflects how much time we're able to have in conversation to really also help ourselves unpack certain things within our own practices that perhaps had the exhibition lead up to the exhibition happening been shorter, maybe would not have happened. And so Tell Me What You Remember for me is quite special in how we had a lot of time for me to also reflect on my own practice over the years. And the catalog actually is it's actually a really beautiful catalog. I think Emma did an incredible job in also bringing in the right contributors. One of the contributors in there is Portia Malaji, who, for me, I hope is a lifetime collaborator who, because also we speak the same language, so my home language is Sesotho, and she's also Sotho speaking, and so how she was able to unpack certain aspects of my work, because language for me is a huge part of my practice, and speaking to the sort of erasures of our languages is a huge part of my research and my work. And so Portia the text that she wrote in there is absolutely one of my favorites because, because of, I think, how she gets certain things that, sometimes, and actually what they did with this exhibition, which, what Marina and the team did with this exhibition, which is also something quite special as I'm speaking about the moment with Portia, was the full translation of the exhibition text in my home language, Sesotho, and that for me is a first, and actually the translation was so good that even when I asked my family to read through it and to give feedback, because they sort of know the original language, which is not so common, they were so impressed about whoever they got as the translator. So thank you for that.
I will thank the translator. Thank you. Wow, beautiful, Lebohang. I think maybe it's time that we open a space for your questions, dear guests. Are there any? Come on, don't be shy. I believe you have at least one. I see it. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. I have a question. Actually, I have two questions, but I'll go with the easier one maybe. How did you decide, or how did you choose your medium to tell your story? Because I'm kind of sure that there were other ways to also tell the story, which is like your story is kind of unique and very personal and local. But how did you choose that, okay, I'm gonna tell my story in this way?
So with this work specifically, the first idea was very clear. It was the building of the house. So it sort of started there, and we thought, there's times when with your first idea, you think you might simplify it, you might, but somehow that became the decision and the sort of starting point. And because then we then decided that, so one of the earliest conversations with Marina was she had been made aware of the installation that we had built, which was actually our sort of first outdoor installation in Boshendal in close to Cape Town. And, so she had envisioned a similar type of work for this show. And we're like, okay, but the work already exists, so we can just bring it here. But she was sort of insistent that it had to be a new work. But also because at that time I'd been thinking for quite some time about what is this moment of 30 years of democracy? Like I'm struggling to find where I stand, I think, with this moment. And so I think because of those sorts of questions, and we had already decided the sort of material or direction of the work, that's how the decision was made. And then the mythology part came slightly later, but quite soon into the discussions. And because obviously the work is about myth, the theater part or the theatricalities were a huge part of it and how that story needed to be told. And so that's basically how the work came about. And the deciding that it would not have walls, this house would not have walls, was also important because it was also about people sort of walking through this installation or this house that's not so stable, but also how stories also are not just living in a house, because, for us as children or for me growing up, these stories I'd be told, you tell it to the other, and so it's a story that's also not contained, and so the house also has this sort of non-containment, and also how you experience the four rooms. The rooms almost seep into each other, so it's a four-room house, but it's you're not really sure if this one of the characters or one of the elements are part, to some degree, what room they're part of as well.
Thank you.
And second question?
She already answered. Yeah.
Okay. We have one question on this side.
Oh yeah, I just have a short one. I'm not super familiar with your work, so I'm discovering it a bit for the first time today. But I'm wondering about your choice with black and white or color. I see also some as more like sepia. Yeah, what lies behind that choice?
So the black and white has actually been a main part of the work. Color, to a large degree, was the earliest work, Gilefalaka, which was the series with my mother. And for me, that work, I could not imagine it in any other way, because the clothes were a huge part of that work, because the work is very much about me losing my mother and then realizing that a large part of the clothes that she was wearing in these photos, which were photos of her in her 20s, were still in her wardrobe, and then tracing the locations where she'd been photographed. And so the clothes and the location and was a huge part of this sort of reimagining of my mother in her youth, but also of this presenting this future through these photographs. So me staging my mother as this moment where we almost live together forever through this image. And so the image is obviously in color, and so it made sense to keep the work in color. The rest of the work over the years is very much in black and white, except for the film that I mentioned that we produced in Cameroon. I don't know if I've made conscious decisions about, keeping the work in black and white. Somehow that's sort of become the language for the work. And perhaps it has to do with, I don't know, I want to say staging, with set design, but I don't know if that's the reason. So I haven't quite figured that out yet.
I really loved the way you were speaking about and relating to community, to family, to your aunts and uncles. And I thought about whether you could share with us perhaps a personal story or a memory that affected you, maybe as a kid, to go into art and to do what you're doing and to really inspire you to create.
So I think I'm just going to finish off the last answer. Because actually how I started working with black and white cardboard cutouts was with the work, so Gilefalaka had two parts. It was Gilefalaka, her story, which was about my mother, and Gilefalaka, her story, which was about my grandfather, and as I mentioned, him sort of moving to the city. And both works were very much linked to the family photo of sort of thinking about these two figures. So my grandfather he had also passed away, so he'd passed away before I was born. And so when I was doing this research on the family name, I had never met him, and so because he kept on becoming this recurring figure in the stories, that's how I ended up making this work that was not, I'd not intended for the work to become about him, but that's how the decision was made. But because I'd never met him, all I had were photographs of him, and in all of the photographs are black and white, and in all of the photographs he was wearing a suit and a hat, and so the work that then resulted was me imagining the stories that my family was telling me about my grandfather and his journey to the city, and their memories of him. And so me reenacting my grandfather by finding a suit that was similar to the one that he was wearing in most of these photographs. And obviously then the work had to be in black and white because the original source material was in black and white. But in the work, I'm the only color subject, because that also is about this idea of like past and present, or past and future to some degree. So I'm performing him, but I was the only person or the only subject in that work in color. So, but now my installations have sort of continued to become in black and white because of, I think, how I started, but also because a lot of the source material is also in black and white. So now I remembered. And in relation to my family or family stories and if and how that inspired me to go into the arts, I don't know if I would say that that's how it happened. I somehow found, because I loved literature and I loved performance, but more so I think literature. So I was always drawn to stories, and but I thought, as I mentioned, I thought that I had to become a storyteller or writer. I had to study journalism because I didn't know. My family or I didn't know that much about like the creative space and the sort of opportunities or options for you as a writer. And so that's sort of how it happened. But I had the freedom to continue with my exploration of whatever creative direction I wanted to go into from my family, but I don't come from a creative family. And so even with photography, I held a camera for the first time when I got to the Market Photo Workshop when I was 19. We never owned a camera at home, and so I was not, and so photography as a medium was not something that I was that familiar with. I grew up with photographs because of my family photo albums, but I didn't even think that could be a career, that people had that as a career, because in the township what you have is somebody that we call a cameraman, and that's like the street photographer who's documenting, I'll speak about the 90s and before that, who's documenting the people in the community. So if you wanted to have your portrait taken, you would set a date, so the street photographer would be cycling, and if you see him and maybe you have a birthday coming up, you tell him, or if you just wanted to have your portrait taken, you tell him, and you'd be dressed for the portrait, and that portrait would take place in your house or in your yard, your place of your choosing, but you'd basically stage, the character that you sort of wanted to portray for this portrait. And so obviously things have changed over time, and in the moment then when I got the camera in my family, then obviously there was more of like photography presence in the house. So it's also funny that we never had a camera, but my family has so many photographs, and that's actually what's allowed me to be able to make a large part of my earliest works using these personal archives from my family.
Thank you. There's one more there.
Hello. I had two questions for you. The first, I was just wondering, in your life and in your journey as an artist, would you maybe mind sharing, especially since you said you started photography late in life, you didn't have a camera until a later age. Was there a particular...
Could you please speak a little bit louder?
Oh.
Thank you.
Is there a particular exhibition or maybe work of art when you were younger that was really transformational to you, kind of in your journey as an artist, that really inspired you to want to do this? And then the other question that I had was if there's any contemporary artist now whose work is really resonating with you or inspiring with you just lately that you've come across?
So what I didn't mention about how I actually ended up or arrived at the Market Photo Workshop. So I was 18, we were preparing for our last exams before applying for university. And one of the papers that they'd given us, which was from the previous years to help us prepare for what to expect for the exams, was an English paper that it was a comprehension test basically from one of the previous years, and it was titled "The Life and Death of Photojournalist Kevin Carter." And so this is me at 18 hearing the term photojournalism for the first time. And before that moment, I was clear I wanted to go and write and be a journalist. And then I got home just really trying to sound clever, and I said to my mom, when I study journalism, and when it's eventually time to major, I'm going to major in photojournalism. And so not really with the full understanding of what that even meant. And so when I didn't get into journalism school, we had found out about, or my mother had found out about the market photo workshop and the course that they offered on photojournalism. And so, just by me having said that and, not even really with the understanding, it's sort of how I ended up at the market photo workshop. And so the market photo workshop was really instrumental in introducing me. And this is a school or training facility, but like a school that has a sort of, that was started by the late photographer David Goldblatt. And he wanted, so this was during apartheid, he wanted to create a sort of workshop space or a resource space or resource center for people of color to be able to gain access to the medium that would allow them to document their own communities and tell the stories of what was happening in South Africa. And so that's how the Market Photo Workshop started. And it has later become a really important institution on the continent that is, and it's now a globally recognized space because it's produced some of the best photographers from South Africa and from the continent because of also, I think, its model. And the sort of, for me, even though it was started with the intention of this documentary aspect of documentary photography, our generation of photographers that then came, I mean, it was now post-apartheid, and our questions were different, and our what we wanted to document were also more questions around identity in the sort of post-apartheid South Africa, and so a large part of like what I was introduced to, how I was introduced to photography has a lot to do with that space. And I'm trying to think of photography shows that I saw that were really interesting. I'll go back to Santu Mofokeng. I think for me, he was quite instrumental in being able to help me think through photography alongside imagination, alongside the spiritual, alongside language, because he's also Sotho speaking, and I think how he unpacks photography through language is something that I could relate to, and so he's been quite instrumental for me and my practice.
Thank you. I think we have one more question here.
Hi, good evening. I'm curious to know if your workflow changed throughout the years, so thinking from your very first work to now.
Workflow?
Yes.
Yes, it did. I mean, the first few years were interesting. I think the first few years for any artist are challenging. You're trying to find not just the language, but whether you're sticking with it, whether you can actually have a successful career and whether actually it is a career. And so because I'd never, so when I finished my studies at the Market Photo Workshop, I'd never decided that I'm actually doing this. I'd ended up there by chance, and I'd spent the 2-3 years there enjoying experimenting. And then in the moment then when I then produced Kilefalaka, which is straight after the Market Photo Workshop, so I was still working on television productions or television sets at the time for the 2 years, still trying to find my way. And then I produced Kilefalaka through the Tierney Fellowship, and it blew up, and it became, it sort of took my name like out into the world. And I had to make a decision whether this was actually something I wanted to do or not, because that work sort of prompted like global recognition. And then I decided actually I'm gonna go study fine art, and then I majored in sculpture. And so that's also why, to some degree, the work also has the sort of sculptural element to it. And so so I think it took me quite a few years to decide that this was actually what I wanted to do. But now I'm comfortable to to sort of call myself an artist. And it's obviously taken me a long time to also build a sort of studio practice where I have a team and I'm not the one doing certain tasks where we are supporting, where I'm supported by by people that are there for me and that believe in my practice. And especially because I've had an independent practice for such a long time, not working with a gallery. And so building the team and building a studio team and a strong studio team has been a huge part of my practice, and it's elevated how I work. But also over the years, we've managed to find different studios, like by studios I mean different, whether it's industrial designer, fabricating studios, like all of those people that also help the work to get to the sort of quality that the work is at today. It's taken a long time to find the right people to collaborate with. The first years were obviously tricky because sometimes you can't pay the amounts that are necessary for you to get the quality of work that you want. So it's been many different stories, different outcomes, because sometimes of budget or sometimes having not built enough of a network that you're able to find the right people for the work that you are creating. And I think I hope I answered you, and I think we have a last question just behind you.
Great.
Yeah, I guess if I would have had a coffee with you, I probably had thousands of questions, so I'm just going to ask one. Coming back also to the different disciplines that you actually, like different medias that you're using, because I also work in different things, that sometimes it's difficult for me like to put down the ideas when I work on different media, so I'm just very curious on how does it look like visually, your process, by finding your ideas, putting them down, to starting to actually produce something, like very practical visually.
So I think that's also why we've also gotten to a point where we are clear that we do want to build the center, is because it takes many steps and it takes many people. And so, as I said, my sister comes from a script writing background. Anna Reverdi comes from many different backgrounds. Also from an intellectual law property background, which I will say is a useful thing to have in the studio. But also coming from a background where she works with a lot of musicians, and so that also comes through in the film works that we do. And as I said, with my sister, her coming from a script writing background assists or is really helpful in some of the works that we do. But with the rest of the team, it really is people that are assisting with different projects, and so sometimes it's short, short contracts, depending on what that project actually sort of requires. So yeah, so the processes are really different in terms of just from the beginning to the end. It can start with really 3 months or a year sometimes of pre-production being researched, like the work that we're doing in Cologne that was about Cameroon. So we spent a year and it was on research, but you're not on it every day. So so it's different processes. Sometimes it's the sketching for a few months and bringing in, so it's super collaborative, different steps for different works.
Thank you, Lebo. I think that's it, and I would like to close our discussion. I would like to thank to you, Lebohang, for enriching our evening and sharing your powerful story, and thank you all for being with us. I wish you a lovely evening without the rain, and enjoy the rest of the Berlin Art Week. And for everyone who is interested in the book, I'm inviting you to come closer to the stage where Lebohang will sign them. Thank you.